Thank you so much for being on this call, for joining. I'm so thankful that you're spending time with us today, particularly with me. You're making it so I'm not just here talking to the air, but I'm also just excited to talk about this subject of wealth languages and give you a little background on what it is. And the whole kind of premise behind this is just to improve communication around the subject of money, specifically in marriage. But as you'll find out, it relates to other things as well. So that being said, I haven't gotten any chats or text or anything of that nature that says we're having any sort of technical difficulties. So to that end, that should mean that everyone can see me and hear me. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, let me just say the name of our company is Archetype Wealth Partners. If you're familiar, today is not about selling anything. We are a wealth management company. We're striving to help our clients thrive across generations, and that's kind of our mission, is to help families thrive across generations. But we get the inordinate opportunity to press in and develop unique content around what we call these elephants in the room about wealth, not the least of which is money and communication around money in the context of marriage. And so that's kind of how, and I'll give some more detail to this in a minute, but kind of how the wealth languages were born. But that's the name of our company. And as I mentioned, our mission is helping families thrive across generations. And there's really four key areas that we focus on as a business, and this will relate to what we're going to talk about today. But we call these the Four Quadrants. And I grew up in the wirehouse at Morgan Stanley as a financial advisor. And one of the things I noticed is there are a lot of smart people at Morgan Stanley, and I'm sure at every big major firm, Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, notwithstanding. But predominantly, people tend to stick to just investments. And that's the top left quadrant that you're seeing there. And unfortunately, wealth, as no doubt everyone on this call I think knows and would agree with, is so much more than just investments. And yet that was kind of the singular conversation. But overarchingly, there's additional quadrants that wealth impacts. Number one, first and foremost, probably your strategy. And as I always like to say, it's kind of hard to define your how you should be invested if you don't have a strategy. That kind of encompasses your entire financial plan, your budget, your cash flow, how that might impact your estate, so on and so forth. Very tactical execution as it pertains to strategy and investments. Very left brain oriented, technical, as I would like to say. But on the right-hand side of the screen, you see family and legacy, and those are things that often don't get discussed in the context of money conversations. We think, as you'll see in here in just a minute, it has an inordinate impact on your wealth, and not just from a dollars and cents standpoint, but also in the context of how it impacts you personally and your family. And so the family and legacy piece of what we do is critical, and that's a function of why we think the content of wealth languages is important. So to that end, one of the quadrants we're really going to focus on today is family. So kind of where the wealth languages fits into is on the family side of the equation. And there's a series of principles that we adhere to as a company. We actually have 12 principles. But I've kind of highlighted three that I think will influence or have influenced the wealth languages that we're going to talk through today. And that's what you're seeing on the screen now. The first is having fun together. I think when you think about, at least in my marriage, if I can be vulnerable, even though I'm in the business of investments, of talking to people about wealth, business owner, whatever it might be, even in my own marriage, in my own life, sometimes talking about money is not fun. And one of our principles is money's this big, scary subject a lot of times as it pertains to kind of the planning side. How are we going to invest it? But it should be fun, and we should be able to have fun conversations about it. Well, it's one thing to say that, it's nothing to do it, but nonetheless, it's a principle that we adhere to. Money is just a tool. It's just a resource. And if we can't leverage it to be a tool and a resource that's doing good things, positive things for our family, for ourselves, and contextually speaking, have fun with it, then it's not worth it. So have fun together is a principle. The next is life is a team sport. I think anyone that has grown up playing sports of any kind or probably achieved any sort of success, I think would agree with the fact that you don't just do it by yourself. Each one of us, we might be inordinately blessed or wise or smart or whatever. God's gifted us in different ways with different talents. But nonetheless, we didn't get to where we are without someone helping us along the way, whether it's a little word of wisdom or maybe an in-depth mentorship relationship. And that's true also when it comes to our wealth and our family. It's a team sport. And a lot of times the team we forget about, myself included, is the person sitting right next to us at the table every morning, which is our spouse. And they're a part of that team, and they should be a part of that conversation. And the last is have a written plan. I think I wrote an article about this recently, but if anyone's a fan of the A-Team, you might remember the famous line by Hannibal, the leader of the A-Team, that says, "I love it when a plan comes together." And having a plan is one thing, but actually writing it down is something completely different. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of wealth languages, but unfortunately, it's a simple principle that a lot of people don't do. And it's kind of interesting if you think about it in the context of a business. Almost every business owner will have a plan for kind of the year, maybe 3 years out, 5 years out, maybe 10 years out, whatever. Maybe they're going to transition sell. There's usually a plan in place, a strategy of how we're going to increase revenue or have a marketing plan or whatever it might be. And you write it down. And we don't tend to do that in our own families. And it's such a powerful tool in business. It should also be a powerful tool in our families. So also a principle that I think impacts what we're talking about today. So the first question that I always pose, and now we're kind of jumping into the wealth languages, is the following, which is what you're seeing on your screen, which is, what's the number one risk to your wealth? As wealth management people, right, this should be the primary question that drives us to serve our clients' wealth, right? We at the end of the day, yes, we manage investments, but in order to manage investments, we have to really understand risk. And ironically, the number one risk to your wealth might not be what you think it is. And there's a well-known statistic in our industry that was conducted, a study that was done by the Williams Group that found that 9 out of 10 wealthy families lose their net worth by the third generation. Matter of fact, it's 70% by the second generation, 90% by the third generation. And that's a pretty sobering statistic. So to kind of go back and answer that question, what's the number one risk to your wealth? Well, clearly, if 9 out of 10 families are losing their net worth by the third generation, there's got to be a reason for that. And so there was a follow-up study that was done. It was about 3,000 wealthy families, and the follow-up study is I think really where the rubber meets the road, because this is just a stat, right? 9 out of 10 wealthy families losing net worth by the third generation. Well, if your brain operates the way mine does, I tend to question a lot of things. And so my first response to this is challenge that as well. That's just a data point. It has no meaning if you can't tell me why that's happening. But nonetheless, a follow-up study was done, and this is what they found. What you're seeing on the screen is kind of the reasonings why that 9 out of 10 statistic exists and the breakdown of that. And the one I want to point out to you is this little purple sliver right here. This is where I think a lot of people would probably put an overemphasis of why wealth declines across generations, is that there's got to be some sort of a bad investment, some poor legal advice, maybe some bad tax implications. And while that does occur, what you're seeing on the screen is that it's only 3% of the time. So, contextually speaking, that's a very small potential risk to wealth. And yet the other 97%, it's less tangible. We can't quantify it and say, oh, well, we got a bad return here. But nonetheless, it's a significant risk to wealth. And the biggest one being this blue chunk right here, which is a breakdown of family communication and trust. And to kind of take that one step further, I would say, you could argue 97% of the risk to wealth, at least based off this study, has nothing to do with investments and everything to do with probably first and foremost communication. I think inadequately prepared heirs, there's a lot that we could unpack there, but I think part of that is not communicating well. And then, of course, failure to establish a family mission. Well, you can't really establish a family mission if you're not communicating well as a family to begin with. And so that's the irony to me, is in our industry, we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about investments, and rightly so to a degree. I mean, it's our job. But if our job is also to highlight risk, then how are we not talking about this? How can we not bring this to light, that communication is critical to the transference and the longevity of wealth? And to me, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek. I think the way God tends to operate is, even if you're what this tells me, at least, take it with a grain of salt. But what this tells me is even if you're the greediest person in the world and all you care about is money, based on these stats, there is an incentive to actually improve communication and family harmony around the subject of money. So that is kind of the driving force behind why I kind of went on the kick to develop the wealth languages. And, part of that, kind of expounding upon that a little bit further, is, as wealth managers, we're often kind of the third party in a room. And when you're talking through, in particular, a financial plan, people's goals, objectives, and kind of the what I call kind of the honest assessment of reality of where we're at today and how that impacts the what ifs of life and what can we achieve, and all that kind of data is just sitting there. Husbands and wives, no doubt, talk a lot about that. And as the wealth manager, a lot of times you're just the fly on the wall, watching this take place, and of course adding your opinion and advice, etc. But as the third party, I was able to see frequently how husbands and wives would be saying a lot of times, from my perspective as a third party, the same thing, and yet communication clearly was not happening. It was like they were speaking different languages. And then, of course, go home and have my own experiences and conversations with my wife. And maybe if you're like me, you've had this experience where you feel like there's words coming out of your mouth, but they must not be in English, because the response, either verbally or just visually on the face of my wife, is like, clearly I must be talking in some other archaic alien language, because she is not comprehending what I'm saying. And that obviously frustrates me just as a human being in my own relationship. But I also found it very fascinating to watch it as a third party, because in that moment I had no in-depth emotional connection, or particularly to the money itself. And so I was able to kind of see, like, wow, people can communicate, but not necessarily be communicating together. And I don't think that's a shock to anyone on the call. And part of that led me to think about when my wife and I went through, long ago, when we first got engaged and we're going through premarital counseling. Some people might be familiar with a book called The Love Languages, written by Dr. Gary Chapman. And that was a book we were encouraged to read as part of our premarital counseling. And, it was nothing radical, but it was really helpful to both of us, because it kind of contextualized and gave some language around the different ways that we give and receive love as a husband and wife. And so my wife is wired to give and receive love a little bit different than I am. And it wasn't like a cure-all, didn't solve every problem, so to speak, or every argument, but I was better, and I think my wife has told me she would feel the same way. We were better because of going through that and putting some definition to the way we communicate and the way we feel and what motivates us around the giving and receiving of love. It enhanced our empathy for one another and our understanding for one another, and improved the capability of communication. And so, as kind of been this financial advisor and watching these different conversations take place as the third party in my own marriage, I began to wonder that perhaps there are different ways that we communicate. There's different intrinsic motivators that influence the way we communicate about the subject of money, about wealth. And hence, the wealth languages was born through a lot of research, a lot of trial and error, et cetera. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. But wanted to give you some background to kind of give some context to why we think it's important. And some statistics to probably hammer that home. What's the overarching problem within this? Of course, we've already highlighted the 9 out of 10 families fail across the generations, the wealth that is, but also within the relationship itself. What's the number one source of stress and conflict in marriage? Well, it's money is the number one reported source of stress and conflict in marriage, and it's also the number 2 cause of divorce. The only cause of divorce that's ranks higher, if you want to call it that, is infidelity. So money is a big problem as it pertains, or a potential for big problems in the marriage unit. And I think these statistics probably won't shock you. I mean, it's fairly, I think we've all heard it to some degree, but it's sobering when you actually see it in person. Also, oh, I've just got a text. There are some black shapes covering part of the screen. Let me make sure that that's solved. All right, so let me see. Hopefully this solves the problem. If so, shoot me a little chat box, and hopefully that solves the problem. Also, let me just reshare the screen real quick, and I want to make sure it's a seamless experience for everybody. All right, share, and here we go. Okay, hopefully that solves the problem. Let me know if not, and we'll keep troubleshooting. Okay, moving on. A 2010 study by American Express found that 9 out of 10 couples, they actually avoid talking about finances. And this is no surprise, right? I mean, it's a sensitive subject. It can oftentimes create a lot of arguments, and as a result, people just opt to not talk about it. But nonetheless, this is just the study. And so again, yet more fuel to the fire for why we think the wealth languages are important. But there is some good news, and moving right along here, which is that 94% of people that would define themselves as having a great marriage also report that they regularly discuss money. So on the positive note, what we can gather from this is talking about money is one of the indicators that can potentially lead to having a quote-unquote great marriage, at least by a study done by, if anyone's familiar with Dave Ramsey, Financial Peace University, he has a research group called Ramsey Solutions, and they did this study based on all the different people that have gone through their program, and 94% that responded with the fact that they had a great marriage reported it was due to discussing money on a regular basis. So the good news is by applying some tools to perhaps discuss money within the context of marriage, we can improve the odds that we'll have a great marriage. And then again, Gary Chapman, who wrote The Love Languages, as I mentioned earlier, has this to say: if we are to develop intimate relationships, we need to know each other's desires. And that was kind of the quote, the driver behind the wealth languages is, what are the desires? What are the things that motivate people around money? And how do we, maybe everyone's unique in their own right, but can we categorize them? And ultimately that led to the wealth languages. So here's the first question I like to start with as kind of a prompter to get into the actual wealth languages themselves is, if you had an extra $50,000 to spend, or insert sum of money, the amounts relative, whatever is meaningful to you, it could be $5,000, could be $500,000, doesn't matter. But if you had some sort of meaningful sum of money fall into your lap, where would you spend it and why? And the caveat here is you can't give it away. So all you, goody two-shoes, eager to give away the money, in this context, we can't give it away. We've got to spend it. Where would you spend that extra sum of cash and why? So take just a second, think through it, and maybe write it down, but where would you spend it and why? And the second question, the follow-up question to that, is pretty much identical, but it's where do you think your spouse would spend it and why? So this could be anything. Could be, I'm buying a new car, I'm taking the whole family to Disney World. Maybe I'm going to invest it in my buddy's startup that he was telling me about the other day. That sounds so cool. Maybe it's putting it towards the 529s, the kids' college fund. Maybe it's taking care of the leaky roof that my spouse has been nagging me about for months. Maybe it's just making sure the kids have new school uniforms or private school tuition, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter, but just where would you spend it and why? So take just a second. Where would you spend it, and where do you think your spouse would spend it? As I take a sip of delicious coffee. All right, moving on now into the wealth languages. Now that you have those answers, and they'll come back up here in just a minute, but first and foremost is defining how we are motivated, or how you are motivated when it comes to money. And what you're seeing on the screen is kind of what the wealth languages encompass. And again, as you probably have caught on, I like to work in quadrants. I think they're simple, and I think they're understandable, relatable. But on the left-hand side of the screen, we have I have two axes, but first we have an axis that goes from low risk to high risk. And on the bottom, we have an axis that goes from near term to long term in terms of time. And so we're going to go through each one of these wealth languages, but suffice to say, I believe we are all, the way we're motivated and wired about money and how that influences our communication falls into one of these four categories, which I'll explain in just a minute. So the first category that we're going to talk about is stability, the wealth language of stability. And I've got my funny little meme here, good old John Travolta in Greece. I've got bills, they're multiplying. Now, the stability person is really focused, again, per my quadrant, both on the here and now. So they're not necessarily future oriented, but they're more focused on the present or the very, very near future. And they tend to not be big on the risk scale. They would prefer to not take a lot of risk and make sure that things are stable. And again, as we'll find out in each one of these quadrants, there's extremes on either end of the spectrum in terms of both good and bad, right? On the bad side, I think everybody probably knows this person on the extreme negative of stability, which is the, hide it under the mattress, the, government's going to come take it, whatever it might be, something to do with the fact that they are almost frozen or paralyzed when it comes to thinking about money because there's never enough. But on the extreme opposite end of that spectrum, on the really positive side, and we probably know these people as well, they always make sure that the people around them are well taken care of. And that could be, if money's just a resource to do that. The house is always in perfect order. Everything's always fixed and repaired. The bills are always paid. They tend to be, great, just, I want to say the word homemaker. That's not the word I'm looking for, but they just put people at ease from just a pure stability standpoint of making everything seem like safe and secure in an environment that you can call home, even if it's not your actual home. Even if it's just someone that you just feel at ease because this person makes the world around them a very stable place. And my wife falls into this category, and I'll tell more of our story as we go on. But suffice to say, she cares about the here and now a lot, and she tends to be adverse to risk in general. And maybe you are in this quadrant. Maybe you are someone in this quadrant. Chances are, if you answer the question, where would I spend my meaningful sum of money? If you put something in the box of something to do with the here and now, low risk, right? Make sure the bills are paid, make sure we fixed the repairs on the house or whatever it might be, you might be a stability type of person. And there's context to all of this. Why might you be a stability type of person? And one of the questions we like to ask, and this pertains to not just wealth languages and these quadrants, but just in general, when we meet with couples about their finances, is what's your first memory of money? And this will impact everything we're going to talk about, but I'll pick on my wife for a second in the context of stability. Well, first I'll tell you another story, but we asked a client this one time, and he said his first memory of money was a nice leather couch, but it was sitting out in the front yard. And as the story kind of opened up and goes on, his first memory of money, he was around 3 or 4 years old, and their house had been foreclosed on. Their dad had run a company, it had gone south, the bank came, foreclosed the house, and they were being evicted, and so all their stuff was on the front lawn. And that was his first memory of money. So you might imagine, right, that would impact someone in some way, shape, or form. Clearly, it was a big memory for him, and it influenced the way that he has thought about money ever since then. My wife, now to give you a little context to her story, she grew up in a very tumultuous childhood. Her mom was married several different times, and in one of those occasions in particular, the husband was really not a good guy and took everything. And there was a period of time where they were essentially homeless, living with neighbors. Her and her mom slept in a bunk bed. And so you can't tell me that doesn't impact somebody. I'm not saying positive or negative, but just it leaves an impact. It's a memory. It's a mark. And so for my wife, growing up, in most of her life, there was not a lot of money, or there was a scarcity of money, or there was a fear around how are we going to make ends meet. And even if my wife, being the child at the time, wasn't aware of all the dollars and cents, she was aware of the burden it placed on her mom. And as a result, fast forward, we get married. It influences to this day the way she thinks about money. Her gut reaction to things is to take care of the here and now. Make sure the bills are paid. Make sure the repairs are done. Because what if we lose it all tomorrow? And then we can't repair this, or then we can't do that. She wants to take care of the here and now. And so maybe you're wired that way. Maybe you know someone that's wired that way. Maybe your spouse is wired that way. But again, there's pros and cons to each one of these quadrants. But a stability person, on the positive side, for me and my wife, she really makes me consider the here and now, and making sure that the bases are covered. Things that I tend to not think about or care about as much are very important to her. And as I've grown into that, she compliments me very, very well in the fact that she's a stability person. So perhaps you're a stability person, a little context around that, and maybe glance at what your answer was to the earlier question around the meaningful sum of money, and maybe decide whether or not you might be a stability person. Moving on, we have our future people, and I think everyone can think of this person, and I've got my little meme there. This is the guy that starts contributing to 401k at a young age for early retirement. He's the smartest guy in the womb. But I always think of a good friend of mine. We grew up together. We've known each other probably since we were 3. And when we were big into Legos. And even at a young age, I don't know, must have been 6 at the time, I remember playing at his house in his room upstairs. We've got all these Legos out. He had bought some, or I guess his parents had probably bought him some Lego set that was like for probably like 18-plus-year-olds or something. I mean, it was this giant honkin' pirate ship, 1 million pieces, and to put it together, there were layers of instructions. And he diligently looked at every single instruction, every single piece, had it categorized, and not too much longer, a couple of weeks go by, he's got a whole pirate ship built. And it was to a T. I mean, almost exactly like the picture, working, amazing, a feat that was pretty impressive for a kid of his age. Me, on the other hand, I just like playing with Legos. And everything that I built looked nothing like the pirate ship. It was like some spaceship that had wheels on it, that also had like some vine appendage because it was in the jungle or whatever. The point is, we just weren't wired the same way when it came to playing with Legos. And as you can probably imagine, if I asked you the question, what do you think he ended up doing with his life? He ended up being an engineer, and now he works in the oil and gas industry. But he is a very process-oriented man. And he likes to check the box. And when it comes to money in particular, he likes to think further out in the future. And he likes to take his checklist and go, yep, I'm doing all the right things I need to do to make sure that the kids are going to be taken care of in the future. The retirement plan is going to be taken care of in the future. Just going down that list. So they're long-term focused, but they have a lower risk profile. They don't want to go build some spaceship thing that I was building. They just want to follow the rules, stick to the game plan, focus on the future, and know that things are going to be okay. Predictable future. That's kind of their motto. I would like a predictable future, whereas the stability person I would like to know that when I come home, there's a nice house with food on the table, the kids are all okay, they're in the right school, all that nature within the stability side. But the future side, predictable future. So maybe you or someone you know might be in that future quadrant. The next, where are my moment people at? A lot of people can probably relate to this girl that I've got in this meme. Take the money and run. Moment people are very focused on the here and now, but they have a much higher risk profile, risk tolerance, if you will. And they like to do things that are all about experience, all about something that, what's the phrase? I've been a volunteer with Young Life for over a decade now. And what's the phrase? FOMO, fear of missing out, right? They want to take advantage of every moment that they can. And I think the negative here, we know this person. This is the person that, they get a windfall, and the first thing to do is they buy a boat. They spend everything on the boat, and then the boat sits in the front yard, and they never go use the boat. But it was all about the moment. I've got money. I've got to spend it on the boat. I always wanted a boat. On the positive side of things, these are the people that actually help us enjoy life. They're all about making memories for their family and making sure that those are maximized. And again, like with all of these quadrants, it's not that the other ones don't matter. We all, I'll get to this more in a little bit, but we have bits and pieces of all these quadrants innately in each of us, but we all have one that we gravitate to the most. And for moment people, they like to take advantage. My mom falls in this quadrant, just so you know. She is all about creating an experience that we can have a memory about. And so it's still focused on the here and now. So if she got a big pile of money, she would take everybody, not just the kids and the grandkids, but all of her cousins and any friend. She was the person that would, she would fly on an airplane pre-coronavirus, and we would, land back in Houston, and someone that she met on the airplane would be coming to our house to eat dinner. That was my experience growing up. She was a moment person. She just liked to live in that moment. And as a result, it influenced the way that she thought about the utilization of money. So maybe you know a moment person, maybe you are a moment person, or maybe your spouse is a moment person. And the last quadrant is opportunity. And I love my little meme here from Toy Story. We've got good old Buzz Lightyear and Woody, and Buzz is saying opportunity. Opportunity everywhere. And there's Woody with that look on his face that I have seen on my wife before, just pure terror. And going back to being vulnerable about my own marriage, this is where the rubber meets the road for us. I'm an opportunity person. My wife is a stability person. And as you can imagine, just looking at these quadrants, that can create a lot of potential conflict. When I think about the utilization of money, I like to think about the things it can afford me to do that are opportunistic in the future. I like the things that I can take advantage of now. They're going to pay off dividends in the future. And it's not always related specifically to payoff of money. It could be a payoff of experience or something along those lines. But it's more long-term focused, and it's about taking advantage of that opportunity. A lot of entrepreneurs fall in this category. A lot of real estate people fall in this category. It doesn't mean that your profession automatically puts you in one of these quadrants, but I would say kind of an overemphasis probably would fall in this category that are in those professions. But they tend to be very opportunistic. And obviously, on the extreme negative side of things, sometimes people are so opportunistic, logic goes out the window, and it's like, oh, I got to get in now. Bitcoin's at 26,000, circa end of 2016, or was it 2017? Everyone's talking about it. I got to take advantage of the opportunity. Oh, sorry, I'm banging my, getting too excited talking about this subject. I'm passionate about it, as you can tell. But I got to get in because it's all the rage. Euphoria has hit, and I have to jump on board. And the next month it plummets 50% in value. So on the negative side, sometimes we can be not logical enough, too emotional, and make some really, really poor choices. But on the very positive side, these are the people that a lot of times move the needle in a big and powerful way, both maybe in their own pile of wealth, but also I think just in society in general, and sometimes hopefully in the lives of others as well. They tend to be opportunistic. So in a nutshell, I could go further and deeper into each one of these quadrants, but hopefully that gives you at least enough of a context about each different quadrant and how they're different. And going back to my own marriage, as I mentioned, this can, again, just by looking at the quadrants, can create a huge opportunity. The fact that I'm an opportunist and she's a stability person for conflict. But it also creates a significant opportunity to support one another and to grow one another. And so as we've gone through this exercise ourselves of defining our wealth languages, it's helped me understand her on a much more intimate level in the context of why she's wired the way she is about money, and vice versa, her for me. And it doesn't mean that I always understand it at a fundamental level. Sometimes, to be fair, I still think what she's saying might be wrong, or I just don't agree, or I just can't get there conceptually. But that doesn't mean it's not real to her. And the fact that I know she's a stability person and there's things that's happened in her life that led her to be that way gives me empathy and in a way to hopefully address and speak to that direct need. And vice versa, she can do that to me with respect to opportunity. And what we're going to talk about here in just a minute is how we can fill these buckets for each other and how that allows us to maximize and move on to the things that matter to both of us. And we'll get to that in just a second. But now that we know and have talked a little bit contextually about these individual, unique wealth languages, my next question for you then is, based on your answer before, based on everything I've kind of communicated about these wealth languages, is what do you think your primary wealth language is? You a moment person? Are you all about the here and now but willing to accept bigger risk? Are you a stability person? You like to take care of the here and now. You don't really like to risk anything. You like to think about the future, check that box. Or are you an opportunist? You really like to take advantage of the opportunities that come your way. They're going to pay out down the road. What is your primary wealth language? Again, we have all of them, but where is the one that you think that influences you the most? Because the reality is it also, if it influences the way you think and the way you feel, then it's influencing what's coming out of your mouth. And then the second question, the follow-up to that, once you've defined your own primary wealth language, is what do you think your spouse's primary wealth language is? What do you think your spouse's primary wealth language is? And again, going back to myself, my wife and I are on very different ends of the spectrum. And fortunately, going back again to premarital counseling, I remember we did some personality profile. It wasn't DISC, but it was similar, and it was 4 quadrants, just like we're doing right now. And my little automatic light. If anyone's seen The Office, you might have know the episode where the light goes off and they're all having to wave their arms to get it to go back on. But anyways, premarital counseling, we were taking this personality profile, and I can't remember what it was, but suffice to say, our personality styles based on this little profile were like exact opposites. And the little proctor coming around, of course, just like lobs this little sliver of wisdom in our ears as we're noticing this. He goes, "Oh, that's not good. That's going to be really challenging." And you're like about to get married, going like, "Oh, well, like, should we not get married? I don't understand what this means." But fortunately, we had a good mentor at the time that said, "Hey, yeah, the way your guys are wired, you're going to have a lot of that can create a lot of friction, but you have a lot of ways to sharpen one another, and you have an inordinate opportunity to enhance each other because you fill each other's gaps." And that was the way I chose, even to this day. Still think about it, because probably like any marriage, we still butt heads sometime. But when it comes to wealth languages, just knowing how we're wired really helps us both communicate better, but also see the gaps that I have, see the gaps that she has, and be a support and a complement to each other, rather than just seeing it as we're so different. So the last thing I'll ask you, and this is kind of the fun part when it comes to having this conversation with your spouse, is the following. What's your wealth profile? And what I mean by that is, if anyone's done like a Myers-Briggs, where there's like, you're an ENTJ, a extrovert, thinker, intuitive, whatever it means. You kind of have this little profile that you are. And that's not exactly the same as what we're about to do with the wealth languages, but suffice to say, I think, again, we have all of these wealth languages apply to all of us. There's parts of me that are future. There's parts of me that are stable. There's stability. There's parts of me that are moment. But my primary one, where I gravitate towards 9 times out of 10, is that opportunity quadrant. But the question I have for you to consider is, imagine if your primary wealth language, whatever it is, if you're a moment person, moment, or stability, whatever it is, imagine just for a minute that bucket is full. You've done something with your money or your budget or whatever, where at least for the moment, for the right now, you're feeling pretty good about that. That feels full to me. What would be then your next most important wealth language? Would it be moment? Would it be stability? Whatever it is. And then go on down the list to your last. And again, going back to the potential conflict that my wife and I could have is, yes, I'm a opportunity person, and yes, she's a stability person, so that can create conflict. But one of the things we found out in kind of creating our own profile was the thing that's least important to me, just so you know, is stability. The thing that is least important to my wife is opportunity. So extreme opportunity now for conflict, because it's really hard for me to understand her, and it's really hard for her to understand me. But here's the good news. If you've kind of taken that opportunity to just think a little bit about what your profile might be, the thing where we can connect is this. The second most important wealth language to me is moment. And it just so happens the second most important wealth language to my spouse is moment. So where we find a lot of harmony, where we find a lot of fun, is if I can do my job to have a lot of empathy and understand and work hard to fill her stability bucket, and if she can do the same for me on my opportunity bucket, the place where we can have a lot of fun and common ground is in the moment. Because that's where we both go to next. So in our own personal budget, we spend an inordinate amount of time and money and resources on, for us, it's travel, but it's taking advantage of the moment, but it's only under the context of making sure those other two buckets are filled. So my point in explaining all this is hopefully to give you some context around having a it's interesting. When a lot of, no doubt I did prior to doing these wealth languages, thinking about having money conversations with my spouse, that's like maybe the last thing I want to do, probably last on the list. There's no way that really sounds fun to me, and probably just going to create an argument. But part of the way I'm hoping that these wealth languages can be beneficial to you and to your family is the fact that it's just a very low-key, fun exercise to start that conversation in a way that's not going to create an argument. Because trying to define your wealth language, trying to answer that question of where would you spend the money and why, asking maybe that question of what's your first memory of money. I learned things about my spouse going through this process that I had never learned before. We've been married a decent amount of time, and we've done this with couples that have been married 40, 50 plus years that have learned things about each other just from going through this. Like, oh, I never knew that part of your life, or I never knew that you felt that way, or whatever it might be, just by kind of going through this exercise in a very low-key way, just learning and listening about why they are wired the way that they're wired, and vice versa, being able to reciprocate and talk about things that influenced you, things that impact the way that you think, things that ultimately are in many ways defining the words that are coming out of your mouth. And circumstances play a big part in that. And just because you grew up one way doesn't mean, not everyone that has my wife's story is automatically a stability person. That's not how this works. But I think given the context of her story and knowing that she's a stability person, by her own definition, you can go, oh, I could see why you would arrive there, and I could see why that's very important to you. And so maybe hopefully in your own marriage, as you go through this exercise, talk through this, it will not only be a fun and enjoyable experience and enhance your relationship, but hopefully give you a deeper understanding of how you yourself are wired and how your spouse is wired and how it influences the way that you communicate. Henry Ford has a great quote that I like. It says this: coming together is the beginning, staying together is progress, but working together is a success. And one of those principles I mentioned earlier, life is a team sport. Whether you like it or not, if you're married, your spouse is part of the team. And your budget, we often think of our personal finances separate from our business finances. And yeah, they're different, but as that net worth ticks up, it might as well be its own business. And you have a co-owner of sorts in your spouse, and y'all have to work together. And that's where success comes, at least according to this quote from Henry Ford. So my encouragement is this wealth language exercise, at least for my own marriage, has helped us create new ways to work together and find that success as it pertains to going through our finances, thinking about the future and our financial plan, how we budget for money, even how we give money away. That was a really fun discussion, by the way. If you want a place to start, that might be my biggest encouragement, is start around the subject of giving money away. I know it's probably tougher right now with coronavirus going on, but just a powerful, powerful conversation that my wife and I were able to have around that particular topic. So I'll dive into questions here in just a minute, but I do want to highlight one thing, and I guess I must not have the slide on here, but going back to, where is it? Towards the beginning. Oh, it was the statistic. This one. If I want to just encourage you, and also by way of saying thank you, if you've been on this call and you've listened, you just took, if I can just encourage you in this, you just took one step towards this statistic, that 94% of great marriages say that they're discussing money. Because if you've listened to this, you've thought about it, you maybe wrote something down, hopefully maybe you take this and talk about it with your spouse, you're already on the path. You are taking one step forward, and I'm not saying you don't already have a great marriage. I'm just saying that it is a enhancement. Being able to communicate and talk about money is an enhancement to marriage. It's an enhancement to a relationship. And it's an elephant in the room, unfortunately, that a lot of times, again, based on those statistics we looked at earlier, goes undiscussed, and it just kind of festers. And some people get away with it, and they never have to talk about it. But many don't, and sometimes those festering wounds can creep up at the most inopportune times. Who knows? But none of us are exempt. Money is always going to be have the potential to be a challenging conversation with or without wealth languages. But the hope and prayer of putting these wealth languages together, and kind of all the experiential knowledge we have from sitting with couples, and then the research of thinking through how we're wired differently, and getting to work with some different family therapists on that as well, has been really, really beneficial with this type of exercise to just take that one next step in a very low-key, non-threatening way, at least for me, to improve and enhance communication about money, and ultimately some marital harmony as well. So my hope is that it does that for you. And with that, we'll scroll back over to questions. And what I'll say with that is that chat box function that I mentioned earlier. So again, on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little black toolbar, and there should be a little chat box there, and or a button that says more with kind of 3 dots above it. And if you click on that, you'll see something that says chat. If you do have a question, I would love to answer it. So take just a minute. The only person that will be able to see your questions is me. You can type that in. I don't have to say your name when I answer the question, but I would love to answer any questions that anyone has, particularly as it pertains to the wealth languages, or anything for that matter. So thank you so much for listening, and if anyone has any questions. Yes, good question. So the question is, how can I start this conversation with my spouse? I would recommend, have a date night. If you're in Texas or Georgia, or there's a few other states, I think, it looks like things are starting to slowly open back up, so you might actually be able to get away with an actual date night away from the house. But if not, order from your favorite restaurant, or open up your favorite bottle of wine, and start with those questions I mentioned earlier, which is, if you had some meaningful sum of money that fell into your lap, where would you spend it and why? And then maybe follow up with the question of, what's your first memory of money? That's the first place I would start, is just getting a little context of how your spouse might be wired when it comes to money. I think that's a fantastic place to start. Next question was, does this apply to other relationships? Matter of fact, I gave this presentation to a room full of a little over 200 financial advisors in Orlando. This was back in February, right before COVID-19 got rampant. This was probably one of the most asked questions. And the answer is yes. We actually have some different business owners that we serve that they've kind of applied this in their boardroom. Or I should say their executive committee team, to improve the way they communicate around money and making decisions around money, just by knowing how each individual executive is wired to think about money, because we're different. Myself, I think about it a little differently than other people on the team, at least just innately, and it impacts the way we communicate. So yes, I think it can apply to other relationships, even kids. That's another big one. So would encourage that as well. Next question. How does each language impact the way people invest? That's a good question. If you think back to those wealth languages, kind of on the left-hand side of the screen, you had moment and you had stability. On the right-hand side, you had opportunity and future. And one's about the here and now, one's about the future. And so I think, based on where you are on the time scale, we tend to think a little differently about money. And I think people that fall in the quadrant of the here and now are more focused about the utilization of money. And so they tend to, my experience has been, a lot of those people tend to be less concerned about, the moment and stability. People, for different reasons, are less concerned about the investments. And what I mean by that, stability people are actually very concerned about the investments, but they're more concerned from a maybe we just shouldn't invest it. And then the moment people are more concerned about like, well, when can I use it? Versus the people that are longer in on the spectrum, opportunists and future people tend to be more inclined to actually invest those dollars than the people on near end of the scale. But the irony to both sides of the coin to me is it's really helpful to have particularly husbands and wives like a third party assist with that discussion, because if I'm just by myself, Mr. Stability person, I might not be taking some risk that I need to take based on the objectives that I want to achieve. And I might need someone to push me in that direction, or vice versa. If I'm on the opportunity side of the scale, which me personally I am, I might be too inclined to take risks that maybe I don't need to take. And it's really helpful for a third party that doesn't have the same emotional connection to kind of be able to not call you out, but just in a way we do it, the way we would do it would be with a financial plan to say, like for me particularly, like, hey, you're just taking a risk to take risk. You don't need to do that based on what we know. So I think each language does impact the way people invest, but my encouragement would be a third party can really help based on what quadrant you fall in, maybe push or prod you in a direction that might not be your natural comfort, but could be really good for you based on how you're innately wired. So food for thought there. Do wealth languages change? Yes, I do. No, I don't think wealth languages change. What I meant to say when I said yes is I think there are circumstances in periods of time where one of the wealth languages might all of a sudden become a priority. And I'll give you an example. If you're if you're on really like within a couple of years of retirement, you might be, even though you're an opportunist or a moment person or whatever, in that moment you might be really focused on checking the boxes of like, I know I want to retire in 3 years, so I'm going to really make sure all the boxes are checked. That's a circumstance or a period of time where you might have a wealth language that's not your kind of natural one creep up and become maybe have some inordinate amount of importance. But I think we are all uniquely and innately wired to think about money, and that's our comfort zone. So for me, the comfort zone is thinking about opportunity. For my wife, the comfort zone is thinking about stability. There's times where another one might creep up and become important. You know, when we had our firstborn, our daughter, like immediately following that, like my brain went to future. I was like, oh man, like we definitely need to make sure we've started the college fund, and some of that might be because of my profession, but nonetheless, that became all of a sudden a little matter of importance. But that's not my innate wiring. And once I got through that, I went right back to my opportunity bucket. So hopefully that helps answer your question. Another question, will the video be made available to watch again? Yes, we've recorded this, and I will make sure Leslie, who's here with our team actually doing the recording, how are we going to blast this out to everyone that was on the call, or will we post it on social media? Well, regardless, Leslie might type back here in a second, but regardless, to the person that asked me that question, I will make sure that I follow up with you and we're able to get you a link or tell you where you can find it. So, oh, okay, Leslie says we're going to be emailing it out. So you'll get an email with a link for how to watch this. Next, or possibly the last question, how do you discipline yourself to grow in other wealth languages? Ooh, that's a good question. I guess I'll just give you my own personal experience with that. You know, and maybe it's a little unique since I came up with the kind of concept, but going through the exercise and going through the research, I think for me, I was able to see how, like, because I'm an opportunist at heart and it's the way I'm wired, my bias, I don't think I mean to think of it this way, but I know I do at times. My bias is to think it's the best, right? It's the best quadrant. And more people should be opportunists. But I think it's really helped me to understand, like, and particularly as I started to put names into those different quadrants of people that I know or people that we meet, I was able to see like, wow, like those other quadrants have some really unique and powerful ways that that both impact the way that they operate, but also influence, again, kind of the big kicker here is the way they communicate. And particularly when it's done very, very well. And I'll give an example. There was one couple that came in, and the wife, as an example, was very future-minded, and the spouse was very moment-oriented. Much older couple, already retired, but just the way he was, and I think he had a lot of practice, but just the way he was able to very patiently and just with a lot of kindness and making sure that they also kind of allotted for moment opportunities, if you will, for a spouse as we're going through the plan, it just really resonated with me. It was something that I was like, man, I hope I can do that with that sort of patience and also with that sort of attention to detail, because I tend to not brush past the details. I'm a detail-oriented person, but they tend to be not the most important thing to me, just based on my wiring of wealth languages, particularly in terms of communication. So for me personally, as I think about growing in each one of those other wealth languages, I would say I look for opportunities to kind of contextualize it when things come up in our life, to say, okay, I know that this is a future-oriented task. How can I? One of my favorite novels is To Kill a Mockingbird, and there's that famous line, to really understand somebody, you have to take a walk in their shoes. And that's the thing I always think about is, okay, if I'm going to put on the shoes of a future-minded person for just a minute, and for me, it's really helpful to think about a friend that I know. How would they think about this situation? It doesn't mean that I'll act that way, but it gives me some context. So don't know if that best answers the question, but hopefully at least a little bit. So with that being said, I know we're 3 minutes over our hour mark, so apologies for being just a little bit over, but I'm so thankful to everyone that joined. I hope you found it entertaining and inspiring. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out anytime. The last thing I'll mention is going back to this slide. We do have other webinars coming up if you have any interest. One that's coming up on current market conditions, which no doubt is timely. One that's focused on young entrepreneurs and high-income earners on making your money work. And then one focused on financial planning and generosity that's really unique. So if you have any interest, there's a link on the screen right now. You can go to that and find more information. Additionally, if you have any other questions about either wealth languages or giving strategies, building a financial plan, investing in the markets, etc., we'd love to answer any questions you have about that. Our contact information's on the bottom of the screen there. And then the last and probably most important is if there's anything we can pray for you for, encourage you about. It doesn't need to relate to a webinar, doesn't need to relate to any sort of business needs. We'd love to make ourselves available to do that. So with that being said, I will sign off. Thank you so much for joining. Godspeed and God bless. Take care.